early. 3 minutes to go.
We're just eager to get going here.
Yeah, we've got a lot of good questions today, all from the Grow Hub.
Got a couple from Facebook too, so hopefully they'll be joining us as well.
And then if any instant ones come in through the time, they can be plugged into the bottom so we can add them off the cuff.
Yay,
So,
great.
Yeah.
So maybe you just want to do a little intro, Peter, while we're waiting for people to join.
Sure. So my Subpod's kind of ambition is to make composting definitely part of everyone's everyday life. Make it as easy as possible. We don't want you to get stopped by annoying questions or problems that come up. And so our goal here is to facilitate your good experience with worm composting. And we're sure that once it's underway, you're going to have a great time and a lot of satisfaction. So our goal here is to just bring your questions on, and we'll work on them together. And I'm learning new stuff all the time because of all the varied places that Subpod is being introduced to in the world. So this is great. So we're getting out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that we try to encourage here at Subpod is building community, and whether it be a community of worms or microbes or plants or people, we really want to help support people who've never done these kind of things before. So that's why we created Grow Hub, which is our online community, which has got over, I think, 15,500 people from all around the world now joining us and asking questions and sharing their stories. And yeah, so really, really great to see that happening. And of course, this is how it all started. This live session was to bring these questions that people might have to some of the Subpod experts that we have here. So, okay, well, look, we've hit the 1 o'clock mark. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Peter Howard and Peter Critch, to start with the questions.
Well, I'll throw out just an invitation for anybody watching this. If something hits you while you're watching and you have a question, please just throw it up on the text wherever you are, and we can broadcast it over here and dive into it. Because as Peter said, like, we're constantly learning like subpods or composting in so many different locations. So it really lights us up, and we'd love to hear from you. So during this, if you have any questions, please just pop them in the comments section. And without further ado, Peter Howard.
Okay, let's
from here, Dr. Compost.
So first question we have today is from Deanna. She's asking about in warm conditions over 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the amount of active worms is increasing. Any tips that appreciates the new colony? Well, great you're asking that. Definitely as the temperature goes up, you want to be alert to taking care of your worms so they don't get heat stressed. So the first thing to look at is whether your subpod is in full sun in the middle of the day, and think about strategies for shading it if it's going to keep heating up. Because one thing you want to make sure of is if the temperature gets maybe above, I don't know, really hot, then it's a problem. But I see, I'm just realizing 60 degrees Fahrenheit is not that warm yet. You're just coming out of winter. Got it now. Okay.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Fahrenheit, Celsius.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And I should know better as an American. So, okay, regrouping here. That's great. It's warming up. Worms are increasing. So Peter Critch had a nice suggestion earlier about putting in some molasses. And that just gives an extra food supply to the microbes if you happen to have some on hand. Molasses is a good choice because it provides minerals as well as sugar, and that just boosts your population of microbes. It gives another food supply to the worms. But other than that, I would just say that if you blend your food scraps up and spread that through the bedding, you'll distribute more broken down food for the microbes and then ultimately for the worms. So it'll actually speed up the activity for the worms if you want to go to that trouble.
Hey, Peter, we just got a question in from Alice, who's, believe it or not, is putting her subpod in right now. Great time planning my subpod. So she's got a fantastic question. How many worms should I start with?
Okay, well, if you have the luxury of starting with 2,000, that's a great place to start because it reduces the stress. My analogy is it's like starting a fire from a glowing ember. If you have a bigger ember, the fire will start more easily. If you only have 500 worms, you definitely have to be a bit more careful about not oversupplying food to those worms. So it'll all depend on availability and cost for you. So I would more is better, but if you have fewer, then just start with a cup of maybe a cup of food and blend it up and stir that into the bedding. But I wouldn't wait too long. Soon after you get the worms, it's fine. You just start feeding them. They're more likely to stick around if they have a food supply when they're ready to eat.
Well, let us know, Alice, if you have any other questions. That's great that you're setting up your sub pod today. She said, glad I asked.
Oh,
4,000.
That'll get things going.
I mean, if money's no object and it's not going to break the bank, I mean, that's great. What you'll find if you have that many worms is that your sub pod will be vigorous in no time. So it depends on the size of your household, how much food you're going to process. If you had one kitchen caddy, normally you'd have to a few weeks to get that whole caddy of food in if you're starting with 500 worms. But if you start with 4,000, you could probably be adding most of that food and the worms to get through it. So keep that in mind.
That's cool. Well, they populate pretty quickly too, Alice. Like every 6 weeks, if the conditions are correct, they should double in population. So you'll get to 4,000 pretty quickly.
Definitely.
We've got the next question here. It's another winter question. So I'll go back to previous questions. And I'm going to...
Yeah, the one from Steveland, it looks like. Oh, that's a nice image. Yeah, so question about a number of larger worms hanging out near the surface of the sub pod, and they're guessing they're earthworms. Normally, earthworms will go deeper into the soil than compost worms, but it does depend on the temperature you've got. If it's depends on actually how cold it is there, but there can be quite a range of sizes between the compost worms and regular earthworms that are typically colonizing deeper soil. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is if you take an image of that and send it to us, there is this special category of worms that has a very distinct cream-colored band in the middle of the body, and that's a jumping worm that tends to take over. So I want to make sure to keep those out of sub pods if they're showing up. So send us an image and we'll have a look at it for you.
That's great. Actually, I've had a lot of questions about jumping worms. So
that's the most distinctive feature of them, is a very pronounced cream-colored band in the middle of the body of the worm. Tends to show up. Okay, awesome. Karen's asking a question. I've been feeding the worms all this winter. My first winter with sub pod. Was I supposed to have stopped? No, that's great. Absolutely, keep feeding through the winter. If you've been lucky enough to live in a mild climate with mild winters, then you don't need to go any special trouble to keep them going. But we've had some great inspirations from people in colder states proving that, in fact, you can keep your system going year-round. And depending on how cool the soil gets, you may have to feed a bit less. But just pay attention to whether the food's disappearing between adding food, and then you'll know that you're not overfeeding in cold weather.
Hey, Peter, we just got a comment come in from Martha.
Mm-hmm.
I'll pop it up here for us. My sub pod arrived today. Have worms coming, but also have a 4-tier system. Is it okay to add some worms from that as well? Absolutely.
They'll be quite relieved and happy to get out of the prison of that plastic box and be able to cruise around in the garden through the holes of the sub pod. So you can take as many worms out of that 4-tier system as you want, because you'll find that this will actually handle a lot more food, and the worms will thrive and be happy in the system. So
free the worms, free the worms.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, all composting is great, and I always say awesome for anybody getting out there and trying it. But it's just when you put your worms in sub pod, an underground compost system, they can actually leave and they're free to come back and forth as they please. It's a lot more humane, or wormane.
Free range worms.
Yeah, it's basically modeling nature a bit more closely by having a system in the ground like that. And you'll notice if you've had an old 4-tier system, you'll be appreciating the differences, being able to compare the performance of the two systems. So you'll see for yourself and let us know what you find.
Cool.
Okay, so then we have a question from Anna here. And she's from California, which is a warmer climate. She's asking, they're more active in the winter and therefore need more feeding than colder climates. Yes, you'll get a real feel for your terrain and how much feeding. But basically, if it stays relatively warm, and I know California well, I lived both in the north and southern part of that state. So I would say for that climate, even in the central part, you can be happily feeding your worms through the year, no difficulty. You'd probably have to take a bit more care in the hot months of summer, but wintertime you should just be able to do is spring and fall. Okay, then question we have. Okay, this is from Karen, coming out of winter, and she's saying that this is from a suggestion from Peter Critch that you could add molasses to kickstart the microbes in your bedding, and she's saying that molasses isn't easy to come by in the UK. She's asking, would maple syrup work? It certainly would, but that's a fairly gourmet food to be giving to the worms, and the other
treatment.
yeah, nothing's too good for my worms. So the thing is, you could also consider brown sugar if that's easier to find in the UK, because brown sugar is basically white sugar with molasses added back to it. And the other possibility is sometimes they have these specialty sugars. Muscovado is another one that is less refined and has a lot more of the molasses present, so you could add a bit of that as well. And in a pinch, white sugar would work almost as well. It would just be lacking the minerals that you'd get with the molasses. So anyway, those are various options for you. And
so five-star treatment is your coconut coir bedding and your molasses on the side. It's a bit like your champagne when you're staying at a 5-star resort.
Yeah, that's true. And then Peter had a good suggestion about diluting the molasses so it spreads easily through that bedding, because you want to ideally dilute it out in some water, and so you can spread it so it's not just a glop in one spot, because it's fairly thick stuff. But anyway, yeah, dissolve whatever sugar you're using in water and then spread it through the bedding. But Catherine's right, coconut coir is a really good choice. It provides the fibers in the coconut coir allow a lot of air into the system, so it stays aerobic rather easily, which is something that's key to a really high-performing subpod system, is keeping it aerobic. Okay, next question we have from Andrew in San Diego. He's asking about teaching preschoolers. Oh, that's a great image. So we can say that Catherine's uploaded onto GrowHub a great link we have about a curriculum that's we've helped design for a number of age ranges for teaching from the very young to say middle school age children. And yeah, we've all noticed that when you bring little kids to worms, they're fascinated. They're put them in their hand, and they're really quite curious about them. And then if you tell them that the gold that you're getting from the system is poop, they're providing kids get a good laugh out of that.
So we're not talking about composting kids here. We're just talking about getting kids into composting.
No, I wouldn't even have thought of that. That's true though. That's good.
I think that was a joke when we were going to start. We were calling things composting kids, and then I think we were also talking about composting. I think we had a post about composting human remains. And
Yikes!
It got mixed up with thinking that we were recommending that you compost your children, but
no.
And look, the other thing that like, Subpod's such a great treasure chest, like the kids, it's at their level and it's in a raised garden bed. It's kind of like this thing that you open, like a big treasure chest to look inside. It's really accessible for them. And of course, I don't know, but they love the squiggly worms. They love standing there and naming them and feeding them and aerating them with the tool. And yeah, all the preschools that we've been in contact with, they just have to pick up the compost caddy and the kids come running because they just want to feed the worms. So.
And it's nice that they have an example of a small critter in the ground that's not going to bite them or hurt them. Yeah. And so there's kind of a gentle relationship they can develop with worms and treat them tenderly. And and all of that. So it's
Yeah.
a good
And to
way
understand the relationship too between plants and soil and worms, if you're below ground in the sub pod, you're looking at all of those things at root level. So it's a much more visual experience of what's going on in nature. So yeah.
Yeah, and then to the later ages beyond preschool, if you have microscopes in the school, a great thing is to take some of that compost, add some water, and put on a microscope slide under the microscope, and you'll see an amazing complexity of life that comes to life by having a microscope to watch it all. Okay, next question is from Martha. So she's saying that her compost is thick and heavy, and she feeds it once a week, and she feels like she's putting enough carbon in. Why would it be thick and heavy? Well, I would just recommend putting in more carbon than you're thinking, because pretty much the thick and heavy would over time make it harder for the air to get in. And so in that case, I would choose a carbon source that has a lot of structure. And so either wood shavings, which have a lot of structure, or again, our favorite coconut coir, are two really good choices that will boost it. If you have access to crumbled leaves, that's another one that provides a lot of structure. So that's the thing to keep in mind to correct thick and heavy casting. Okay, next question is from Eric in San Diego. So he's got a question about fruit flies. He's at an apple cider vinegar trap. Yeah, so Eric, what I would say is that normally what happens is if fruit is left on the surface of the subpod bedding, then the mold will develop, and the fruit flies are attracted to the mold that develops from rotting fruit more than anything. And so one of the tricks is if you can fully bury fruit, especially inside the bedding, so you don't have a surface layer, then the mold will not develop and it won't attract the fruit flies. So once your system has been going for a while and you have more volume, it'll be easier to tuck all that fruit down under the surface, and then you'll be less likely to have this. And then check your worm blanket out, make sure it's not got sticky fruit sugars on it, because then you could get mold on that. So mold is going to come from an air interface where you have things at the surface. So you wash the blanket if that's got mold on it, and stick your fruit under the surface. That should handle it. Okay, next question is from Blue Lotus, and she's asking if you can only start with 250 worms. Yes, that's probably the minimum amount. So you slowly add food waste to them, and I would actually emphasize the food waste that is the most soft. So you'll be probably cherry picking out of your food waste. Go for the squishy scraps, the soft fruit, the avocado fruit, and the other thing you can do is soft, like rinds from avocado. That provides a bit of habitat to allow them to breed up more. But just keep an eye on the bedding and make sure that the food's not accumulating, and keep it well aerated, maybe every 3 or 4 days, and then you'll gradually have the worms build up. And make sure you're using coconut coir as your bedding, as the most hospitable bedding to use, because what you're trying to do is avoid losing the worms, and so every worm counts when you've got 250. So give them the best possible start.
That's well said. Yeah, I think you're right. When you're at that early stage, and I just set up my subpod mini, and I grabbed a handful from a community garden that had some worms. And I thought it would be all fine there, just slowly feed them up. But it really, you've got to you've really got to take care of them during those early stages, because not having that large populations and the casting to go with it, you've got to take care of those little guys. That's what I'm learning. I've always been having a bucket of worms with a subpod.
That's actually probably the most important lesson we can give to starting subpod users, is to make sure you're putting a lot of extra care, and also know that that's probably going to be the most important time is in the very beginning if you're starting with just a few worms, and you'll be amazed later on at how resilient your system gets when you've got lots and lots of worms, and you'll be much more relaxed about it.
Yeah. And you can share it with your friends at that stage.
Yes, worm abundance. Okay, a question from Pam. And it's a molasses question.
Another
Does
molasses
molasses
question.
help worms consume the food faster? I wouldn't say that. What molasses' role is basically it's a sugary food for the microbes primarily, and the worms are doing a bit of grinding food up and swallowing smaller food particles with bacteria, and they're actually feeding inside of the worm's gut, and then the worm secretes that as a sort of a packet of ground up food and microbes. So it's more because the worms are consuming some of the bacteria and the molasses eating the bacteria. That's what I would say is happening. Speeding worms up. If you're looking for that to happen, there have been some reports if you put in your coffee grounds, the worms do move a bit faster. So,
Really?
an aside, yeah, some people claim that. I mean, but to be fair, the way caffeine works in simple organisms is not the same. And one of the things that can happen with the heavy nitrogen in coffee grounds is it'll actually warm up your system, and so that warmth can also make the worms move faster too. So it could be happening for a number of reasons. Okay, next question is from Micah, and she's got some sow bugs and black beetles. The worms look happy and healthy. Yeah, this is an example of an insect that likes moist and damp conditions the same as your worms, and so I'm talking about the sow bugs now when I say that. So generally, if they're really becoming a bit more than you like, then there are some strategies that I've suggested to people. And that is that if you, number one is make sure that the wormholes on the outside of your sub pod are well covered so that the sow bugs can't just travel through the walls and get inside. But number two is if you have a dry surface on the top of the subpod inner chamber, such as sprinkling some diatomaceous earth on top of the worm blanket, that will really discourage the sow bugs from taking hold, and also a number of the other insects as well. So diatomaceous earth is a powdered silica that only works when it's dry. So sometimes if the system is particularly damp, you might have to put a second worm blanket where the top one is the diatomaceous earth. But that's what I would recommend, is make a drier environment, and you'll discourage the sow bugs from colonizing. But back to your first part of your question, they shouldn't be a problem for the worms. It's just that they're competing for the same food source. And the sow bugs could travel around into your garden bed and cause a bit of trouble for your plants. So I think it's a good idea to sort of keep them into low numbers rather than overwhelming your system. So the other thing you can keep in mind is in the habitat around the garden bed is make sure there's not too many damp protected spaces that provide habitat for breeding up the sow bugs.
Mika, I like to use the analogy like guests or pests. You have one or two bugs. It's like, they're coming over they're a guest, they're coming over for a little bit, but they'll leave. But if you've got a lot, like Peter's saying, all right, then they'll turn into a pest. They might start nibbling on the food around it. So distinguishing that, and it sounds like you've got a lot in there. So I think Peter, what he's suggesting, to have those preventative strategies to make sure you get the numbers down.
Yeah, it's like your garden buddies. I mean, you are trying to mimic what happens in nature. So, there's all sorts of different things that go into breaking organic matter down and feeding the soil. So, yeah, it's try and see it as something that happens like in the forest floor, as we say.
Yeah, generally what you want to see is that everything's in balance. So you don't have any one thing other than your worms sort of out competing other things. So it's usually a sign that you need to have a closer look at your subpod if you see one particular kind of insect really exploding in population. So you might have gotten too wet or too dry. So if you have a lot of ants, they tend to like a drier environment. If you have a lot of sow bugs, they like it really wet. So you'll generally get a sense after a while of using those as kind of your canary in the coal mine of the environment in the subpod. Let's see. We have a question from Anne from California. This came from Grow Hub. And she's saying, let's see, that question's, okay, can you share more about sifting? I'm assuming she's meaning when you separate the castings from the worms. What I've used for this is a piece of metal mesh that I've put within. I mean, the typical example of this for do-it-yourself version is when composters are separating out the finely composted material from the undigested material. They'll make a bit of a wooden-sided container with a piece of wire between them. The other thing, though, is I've been looking deeper into as a way to separate the castings from the worms, is just taking that wire and then getting a bright light on top of it, so the worms on their own will crawl through and leave castings behind. So if you go to my article on the Grow Hub, I basically describe the size of the mesh that's useful for making your own sifter. And let us know if you have any more questions after having a look at that.
They do in some hardware stores sell like soil sifters, and they also have called bait sifters, garden sifters. But you know what my neighbour had? He had, you know, rainwater tanks where they have that round thing to sift out, you know, where it overflow from your water to go into your water tank. And he had one of those just hanging up, and it was the perfect size hole for keeping the worms out, but allowing the castings to be sifted through. So that was, just maybe just go visit your local hardware store or look online for soil sieves or rainwater tank.
Yeah, you know, it all depends on the consistency of your castings too. The more fudgy and moist they are, the harder the fine mesh will be to work for that. And so, yeah, I'm actually going to work with Peter a little bit on finding the very easiest ways, so it's not a lot of labor for you guys to be sifting out your castings from your worms. Because ideally, you shouldn't be doing this or having to do this more than once every 6 months to a year. It takes that long for your system to fill up. So you want it to be the pleasurable job of getting a bucket full of wonderful castings and not be a chore of a lot of time involved in that process. So I've got a couple of ideas that he and I are going to chat about to provide a simple solution.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up with, you know, a small amount of lovely sieved, and then I ended up with all the rest of the organic matter that just went back into the garden and you know, when I replanted. You know. But look, I think we've got one that's come through from Sonia in Facebook. Do we want to pop that live one up, seeing as though she's here?
Right. Yeah,
sure.
Okay, it's from, there, can you see that, Sonia?
Yes, I just planted my sub pod in a raised garden. There's only 6 inches left on the side for dirt. Is that enough space? Yeah, so it depends on your climate. That's possible to do that. What you want to make sure of is in that kind of a narrow gap, that you make sure that to keep that top well with soil so that it doesn't recede, and that provides an entry point for pests to fly in through the wormholes. But yeah, it should be fine. The other thing to keep in mind is the material that you're using for the garden bed itself. So if it's wood or brick, that'll be absolutely fine, as long as it's not in full sun. And then you might want to think about a bit of shading. If it's metal, you definitely want to have shading when you've got a narrow space between the front of your garden bed and then the sub pod being very close to that. Because I've done some tests to show that you'll heat up that soil just next to the metal quite substantially in a summer sun, and so you want to provide some shade. But you should absolutely be able to do that. It'll be fine. The worms will choose which way they want to leave out of the sub pod in a summer sun, and so you want to. Okay, where are we here? Let's see, a question about, this is from Connie on Instagram, and she's saying she has no idea what's happening, but there's 2 worms attached. Well, they could be mating. That's a real possibility.
Sorry, Peter, can you mute yourself?
I'm not sure what's happening So is that, did you catch that audio fine? Okay, good.
Yep. Yeah, we can.
Yeah,
We got
yeah.
it.
Okay, so that image that Peter's put up there, it looks like it's an example of worms getting together, and you can do a great job of getting better genetic diversity when two worms get together to mate to produce offspring. So that's probably what you're seeing, Connie, when you see that, and no cause for alarm. It's a good sign. Okay, then another one from Eric in San Diego. He's asking if worm castings is just another term for ready-to-use compost. Yes, castings is the term for the material secreted by the worm, and so generally a mature casting, that is, it's been released from the worm and it's about a month old or thereabouts, it'll be mature and it'll be completely ready to use compost of a high quality, I might add, because generally speaking, the nutrient levels are a bit higher in worm casting compost, and as are the microbes. And so it's a generally preferred ideal source of compost for people. But that's, yeah, for intents and purposes, you could say worm castings is synonymous with compost. Uriel from Houston, Texas. Okay, he's writing that his subpod has been invaded by termites. I've heard of this a couple of times, and normally, in my experience, this happens when you've got a very rich carbon source that you've put in, like pieces of intact cardboard, and this tends to happen in drier climates where the cellulose in that dry carbon doesn't get wet, and then you can have termites. So my advice is basically, if you see termites, and it shouldn't be a common experience, but check to see if you've got chunks of a woody material in there, and that's what I would fish out. And then to discourage them from coming back, I've also suggested, and people have had good success with this, is spraying a bit of orange oil carefully, because this will also be aggravating for worms themselves. But if you spray it on the light spray on the inside walls of the subpod above the worm blanket, that'll provide an environment that discourages them from coming back. Okay, Evan is writing, and this question from California and Grow Hub. He's saying ants are attacking, what to do? So normally this would happen. Ants will take up residence in the upper part of your subpod when it's a bit drier. And so one of the things we've suggested to people is make sure your worm blankets stay wet, and they're more likely to be discouraged from hanging out there. Once they've taken up residence, one of my go-to solutions is to make a 50-50 mix of sugar and borax. Basically, the sugar draws them, and they pick up the borax, and that'll take care of them. So this works with fire ants and jumping ants and sugar ants, of course. It's a generally useful solution, and it's benign for the soil. The borax just breaks down to boron, which is actually useful for the soil. And so just by putting it in a saucer on top of the worm blanket, you're keeping it from getting into the subpod. That's my recommendation. Okay, Carol from Grow Hub is saying her worms are disappearing. Should I keep adding food? So you need to figure out, worms can be disappearing for a few reasons. The first is that the environment is not hospitable enough, and they're deciding, hey, I prefer the garden bed to the subpod. So if you send us a picture of the inside of your subpod, that'll really help us diagnose things. But and I think everyone's solution generally as a first step is buy a brick of dehydrated coconut coir and hydrate that up and basically mix that in well. And the advantage of that material is it holds moisture really well. It holds a lot of airspace, and the worms enjoy colonizing it. And then you can basically spread your food thoroughly through that so that it'll not lump up in one place and start to break down anaerobically, which could cause smells that would discourage worms from staying in the subpod. So first step is make sure you get coconut coir in that subpod. And then as to adding food, I would hold off on the food until you see the worms are sticking around. So send us a picture and we can give you some detailed advice as well. Okay, Bernardo from Perth is got a question. Do you think layers of insulation would protect for scorching summers? Yes, certainly. But number one, I would definitely provide shade for your bed and your sub pod. So get the whole system in shade. And as to insulation, not just around the pod, but a heavy layer of mulch on the soil on top of the bed. That's also going to help really well. Because in Perth, you have drier air. If you wet the mulch, that'll actually cool things a bit as well. So the cover of the sub pod being a dark brown, you might want to add a reflective surface on top of that. And between all those things, I think it should definitely keep your soil cool in the sub pod and around the sub pod, and then in the castings as well. Insulation is definitely a good idea.
And the good old frozen water bottle on top of the worm blankets.
I was trying to look for a photo of that. It's such a worm aircon.
Yeah, you can actually put the so to more details on that process is you take a water bottle, drinking water bottle, small one, and fill it with water, stick it in the freezer till it's frozen solid. And you actually can bury those within the bedding with the cap obviously very tight. And what'll happen is as the ice melts inside of the bottle, it'll provide a gradient of coolness around the bottle in the bedding, and the worms can choose where they want to hang out, in their best condition. And then just keep an eye on them. And once they've melted, go ahead and resupply a new frozen bottle or two. And that's helped a lot of people.
You might want to put a casing of carbon material around the bottle, though, because I'd hate to think of a worm getting stuck to the side of the bottle.
Oh, it shouldn't.
Layer of newspaper or something.
No, it should be okay. I mean, you'll get a lot of moisture beating off the outside of that bottle very quickly.
I know. Okay, but when you get your fingers stuck on an ice cube.
Yeah, no, but it'll be fine inside of the bottle.
Smart creatures.
As long as they don't try and wriggle off.
Yeah.
Anyway, more care for our worms here.
Okay.
Oh. Well, you think we're done, team, or have we got
a
more?
wrap? Yeah, we got through all the questions.
That was awesome.
Perfect.
Thank you, everybody.
It happens every week. So next Thursday, same time, we'll be back. Put your questions either into social media saying you want to be answered in the Dr Compost, or go onto our Grow Hub. We sort of post the event every week, so it's an opportunity for people to share their questions. And if there's anything really urgent, just message Peter Howard. He's on the Grow Hub. He's there to answer questions. We're here to help make composting part of your everyday life, as we say.
Nice,
definitely. Anything that comes up that's urgent, that's time critical, and you put it up on that Ask Dr Compost, I'll be happy to respond to that, so you won't have to wait with bated breath until the actual session. Okay.
And thanks, Peter Critch, for setting this up, like that we can stream it through so many different avenues.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
You're
really
welcome.
great. I'm really glad that we can connect with people.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to see the constant questions come in and the engagement we have from people.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth, for joining us and for thanking us. And see you next week.